Welcome to the deep dive. If you are listening to this right now, I know you are gearing up for a major professional planning exam.
Yeah, and that is no small feat.
No, it really isn't. You have probably been staring at, just a mountain of study materials trying to synthesize these really complex urban policy frameworks into something you can actually use, both on the test and honestly in your career.
Exactly.
So today we are taking a massive shortcut through one of the most critical texts you need to master. We are looking at 7 principles of strong climate change planning.
Right. That's the one by Sarah Merrill and Sierra C. Woodruff from the Journal of the American Planning Association back in 2020.
That's the one. Okay, let's unpack this. The authors are basically arguing that while we are seeing an explosion of climate planning globally, which is great, the sheer scope of the crisis is just vastly outpacing the solutions we currently have on paper.
Yeah. The American Planning Association has explicitly stated that climate change will almost certainly prove to be the most important planning challenge of the 21st century.
Wow, the most important.
Right. So Merrill and Woodruff's research takes a really hard look at how the profession is actually handling that challenge. For this deep dive, we're going to look at the current status of things first, and then we will dissect all 7 of their principles. That way, you know every single detail for your exam.
Perfect. So looking at that current status, the authors start by mapping out the historical timeline. If we look back at the 1990s, when the international planning community first really started mobilizing, the entire focus was almost exclusively on mitigation.
Yes, reducing greenhouse gases.
Right. Initiatives like the Cities for Climate Protection Program, which is driven by ICLEI, established the early gold standard. But it was highly rigid, right?
It really was. It was an era totally dominated by carbon accounting. But, as the physical realities of a changing climate became impossible to ignore, planners realized that carbon math alone doesn't stop the flooding that is already overwhelming stormwater systems.
No, it doesn't.
So the research details this necessary pivot toward adaptation planning, adjusting to the actual impacts. However, the data reveals a huge gap in implementation here. A global assessment of 401 cities found that only 18% were actively engaged in adaptation planning.
18%. That is incredibly low.
And it gets worse, because those efforts were heavily concentrated mostly in large, well-resourced cities in the global north.
Okay, so that model obviously had limits, and then that adaptation model evolved recently into resilience planning, right?
Yes, exactly.
The authors note the massive influence of the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities initiative. That funded chief resilience officers in municipalities all over the world. And resilience planning requires you to zoom way out.
You're not just looking at sea level rise anymore.
Exactly. A resilience framework evaluates a community's capacity to absorb a massive variety of broader shocks and stresses. Everything from a catastrophic earthquake to chronic systemic issues like racial inequity.
That holistic systems approach is super valuable. But Miro and Woodruff present a stark reality check on all 3 of these models: mitigation, adaptation, and resilience.
They all have shortfalls.
Right. For instance, with mitigation, a study of 200 European cities showed that while 65% had formal mitigation plans, their actions just weren't enough. Mathematically, the actions didn't align with their own greenhouse gas reduction targets.
They had the goals, but not the actual interventions to hit them.
Exactly. And then resilience plans often suffer from the opposite problem. They cast such a wide net looking at everything from poverty to infrastructure that they frequently lack targeted strategies for future climate risks.
So that brings us perfectly to the core of their work. The 7-principle framework designed to fix these shortfalls. And the foundation of any strong plan is Principle 1. Set ambitious yet attainable goals.
Every plan requires a clear vision, but for your exam, you need to know how the mechanics of goal setting change depending on the paradigm.
Right, because mitigation plans have an easy, measurable goal. Reduce greenhouse gases by X% by Y year. The metric is built right in.
But adaptation plans struggle immensely with this because there isn't a single universal metric for what successful adaptation actually looks like.
There's no standardized unit of measurement.
Exactly, so they often just end up with vague aspirations. But here's the resilience advantage. Resilience plans actually tend to be better at defining goals because they recognize connected challenges.
The text uses Boston as a prime example here, doesn't it?
Yes. Boston's resilience plan is a great case study. They didn't just outline a strategy for storm surges. They directly addressed systemic racism as a core vulnerability that had to be tackled to improve disaster outcomes. The goal was systemic fortification.
That is a fascinating way to frame it. But having a brilliant goal requires the data to back it up, which leads to principle two. Provide a strong fact base using the best available data. So, what does a strong fact base actually look like?
Well, for mitigation, it requires highly detailed greenhouse gas inventories. You can't reduce emissions if you don't know where they're coming from. For adaptation, it requires deep vulnerability assessments.
Evaluating the impacts on water, health, infrastructure.
Exactly. Utilizing future climate projections to model exact localized impacts.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. This is a huge contrast to Principle 1. While resilience plans were better at setting comprehensive goals, they are actually weaker on their fact base.
They really are. It is their biggest weakness.
They often lack basic climate projections. Because they are evaluating such a massive array of societal shocks, they just gloss over rigorous vulnerability modeling. They are great at acknowledging underlying human drivers of vulnerability, but they lack the hard climate science.
That tension is something every planner has to manage. And once you have your goals and your data, Principle 3 says you must outline diverse strategies to achieve those goals.
A multi-pronged approach. You need zoning changes, green infrastructure, capacity building, individual behavior changes, new policies.
The sheer variety is huge, and the strategic prioritization of those tools is vital. Planners operate with limited budgets, so the concept of co-benefits is essential here. Win-wins.
Right, a strategy that helps the city adapt to extreme heat while also reducing greenhouse gases and creating local jobs.
Exactly. And the authors note this is especially critical in the Global South. Over there, mitigation is often a much lower priority than adaptation.
Because they might have a negligible carbon footprint to begin with, but they're facing immediate threats from shifting monsoons.
Exactly. So a pure mitigation strategy just won't get political support.
Uh-huh.
But if it offers co-benefits like protecting against flooding while delivering economic value, it works.
Which is why green infrastructure is a prime example here. It is exploding in global popularity specifically because it offers so many of these co-benefits. Bioswales, urban tree canopies, they manage stormwater, but they also reduce urban heat and provide public green space.
It is the ultimate multi-tool.
Absolutely. So what does this all mean for the people? That brings us to Principle 4. Engage the public and foster justice in all planning processes.
This is all about procedural equity, ensuring fair and meaningful participation. But the research presents a really depressing finding regarding how this works in practice.
It's often dominated by elites, right?
Yes, technocrats, political elites, highly organized interest groups. Because climate change feels so incredibly urgent, municipalities feel this ticking clock pressure to act quickly. So they push deep equity concerns to the back burner.
They sacrifice procedural justice for the speed of deployment.
Exactly. And for the exam prep, you need to know how the plans grade out here. Resilience plans do a slightly better job outlining their engagement processes than adaptation plans, but neither reliably describes actual steps taken to include marginalized communities.
They might say they engage with the public, but they don't prove that vulnerable populations actually shaped the framing of the challenge.
Right, they just ask for feedback on strategies that are already finalized. Plans really must use participatory approaches from day one.
Okay, moving to Principle 5. Coordinate efforts across actors, sectors, and plans. This really gets into the messy reality of city governance. We have to talk about Camel's 3's conflict.
Economy, environment, and equity. The classic planner's dilemma.
Right. For example, a city might recognize the environmental need to ban building in a flood zone, but they are simultaneously facing a massive housing affordability crisis and need the tax base.
It's incredibly difficult to balance. To manage this, the text introduces the vital concept of mainstreaming. You will definitely see this on the exam. Mainstreaming means integrating climate change into standard existing plans.
Like the comprehensive plan or the hazard plan, not just keeping it isolated in a standalone climate document that sits on a shelf.
Exactly. You bake it into the regulatory DNA of the city. The prime example the authors use is, imagine Boston 2030. They actively mapped projected sea level rise directly onto future land uses. The climate data fundamentally dictated where development could occur.
And resilience planning helps here too, because it naturally breaks down traditional departmental silos. It forces public works, housing, and emergency management to actually talk to each other.
But all that coordination is useless without execution. Which brings us to Principle 6. Include a clear process for implementation and monitoring.
The implementation gap here is just massive. I have to drop this statistic from the source because it should wake up everyone listening. In a UK study, over 80% of local governments did a climate risk assessment, but fewer than 40% actually made a plan for it.
And how many implemented them?
Exactly 0% had implemented them.
That is staggering. Diagnosing the risk is easy, but implementation is where it stalls. A clear process requires a timeline, legally responsible agencies, and critically funding.
Funding the gap is always the biggest bottleneck.
Always. Planners have to use creative financial instruments. San Francisco is the great example here. To fortify their 3-mile seawall, they proposed a general obligation bond paired with a special tax specifically levied on waterfront properties.
So the property owners who get the immediate protection are bearing a strategic portion of the burden.
Exactly. The source also mentions resilience fees, or insurance-based fees that send market signals to developers to avoid high-risk zones.
But the act of implementing these projects introduces some really complex secondary effects.
Right. What's fascinating here is the unintended consequences of implementation. The text discusses climate gentrification. Planners usually look at vulnerability through a purely physical lens, who is closest to the water. But you have to monitor the economic fallout.
They use Miami as the example for this.
Yes, in Miami, high-elevation properties are inherently safer from sea level rise, so they appreciate in value. Capital flows to the high ground, which drives up housing costs and actively displaces low-income residents who have lived in those elevated neighborhoods for decades.
It's a devastating feedback loop. You invest in infrastructure to make a neighborhood resilient, only to price out the vulnerable populations you were trying to protect. Monitoring absolutely has to catch these injustices.
It can't just be tracking if a seawall was built. It has to track the distributional consequences.
Which leads us to the final principle, Principle 7. Address climate change uncertainty.
This is philosophically the hardest one, embracing the unknown. Planners are designing infrastructure for the next 50 to 100 years, but dealing with imperfect science, unknown future emissions, and totally unpredictable politics.
So how do you plan for the unknowable? The authors define a concept called adaptive management. It's a flexible, iterative governance approach where plans are regularly adjusted based on new monitoring data.
You don't just print a static blueprint and walk away.
Right. And you have to stress what they call no or low regret strategies.
Strategies that benefit the city regardless of what happens with the climate.
Yes, like investing in an electrified public transit system. Even if climate projections are less severe than we thought, the city still benefits from less traffic and lower localized air pollution. You need robust strategies that work across multiple future scenarios. But the sobering reality from the text is that there is a massive gap here. A recent assessment of 44 U.S. adaptation plans found exactly 0 used scenario planning or robust strategies.
0 out of 44. There is a lot of room for planners to improve.
Definitely. But that brings us to the conclusion of the source document, The Seeds of Good Climate Change Planning. And we want to bring the energy back up because there are genuine reasons for optimism here.
There are. Despite the gaps we just laid out, public concern is rising, and cities are trying really novel approaches. The technical capacity is expanding.
And the planner's power is real. There is a massive wealth of resources available. The text points out that groups like EcoAdapt have cataloged over 3,500 resources from 80 different organizations.
The frameworks exist, and here's the ultimate takeaway for your exam. Planners are uniquely equipped to handle long-term uncertainty, balance those 3 E's, and coordinate diverse actors.
And the data proves it.
It really does. The research explicitly shows that adaptation plans prepared explicitly by planners demonstrate stronger goals, diverse strategies, and better monitoring than those prepared by other actors. Your profession is built for this.
Absolutely. So congratulations on making it through this dense material. You are now armed with the exact structure, the stats, the Boston and Miami examples, and everything you need to crush this section of your exam.
You've got this. But I want to leave you with one final unaddressed question that builds on this text. If the data clearly shows that plans made by planners are empirically stronger, what structural changes need to happen within local city governments to put planners at the absolute center of climate action, rather than just treating them as one advisory voice among many?
That is a powerful question to mull over. Good luck on your exam, trust your preparation, and remember to keep diving deep.